The Crossed Dead or Alive comic book miniseries is what remains of what initially was an independently funded film that later turned into a series of webisodes, and finally, a long-dead project. Like the other Crossed stories that we have explored, this miniseries also focuses on human values and psychology and how it can transform in the face of adversity, and I mean really sickening adversity. How, sometimes, people's own drive to survive can lead them to make choices that blur the lines between the Crossed and humans. With that out of the way, let's dive right into the story. Crossed Dead or Alive issue number 1, What It Takes to Survive. The entire series is narrated by our protagonist, Richie. Richie has been surviving on his own since the C virus broke out. This has hardened him, taught him survival, but most of all, it has given him the ability to be brutal, rational, and blunt. The first page shows us the upper half of a crossed skull lying on the ground, with the crossed rashes clearly visible on the bone. This is a clear indication of how the infection spreads and how deep the scars go. We then see Richie in the modern day. He is battle-hardened with an overgrown beard and dead eyes. He carries a scoped rifle as he tells us about how it all began and how he hates the current situation that he is in. Richie's words make it clear to us that he hates his current band of survivors, but he starts his story ominously by telling us all that he has learned about survival and the people that survive in this apocalypse. He tells us that where, when, and with whom you were with on the day of the outbreak dictates your survival. As Richie continues walking alongside his group, we see him kick the crossed skull on the ground that we saw on the last page. Dust kicks up as he begins to tell us about the day all of this began. He was on a flight with his fiancée. Richie still clearly remembers the pilot's instructions once they had reached the cruising altitude of 30,000 feet. It was a boring Virgin Airlines flight headed from London to Los Angeles with a stop over at Dulles. That is where Richie and his fiancée had boarded the flight. It was a beautiful night with the full moon shining brightly in the sky, but Richie remembers that even then he wasn't feeling that great on the inside. As the flight attendants begin serving meals, we finally get to see the young Richie. His eyes still have the same dead look, but this time they lack something, the peripheral awareness that comes with survival. He looks dead on the inside and quite frustrated, and that is because his fiancée had just forced him into telling the flight attendants that they just got engaged. Richie hated that moment, the moment he had decided to give in, but now that after all this time he remembers this incident, he tells us that maybe his fiancée saved his life, because once he had confessed to their engagement, their seats had been upgraded and they were taken upstairs. We then see the young Richie give a murderous look to Kelly, his fiancée, while she reads an in-flight magazine. He had hated the way she had whined to him just to get their seats upgraded, but now that he is recounting the story, he finally admits it. He finally admits that Kelly saved his life that day. Richie looks outside, but all he can see is his own reflection due to the darkness. He seems sad and full of regrets, and that is because he was questioning all his life choices, including his proposal for marriage to Kelly. They both were taking this flight to go meet Kelly's parents, but Richie never had high hopes for this meeting. He confesses that he in fact didn't like Kelly's parents at all. He thought that Kelly's father while her mother was a pretentious woman, something Richie dreaded that Kelly would turn out to be after their marriage. Richie remembers that he had been having doubts about their relationship even before he had proposed to her, and yet for some reason he had just decided to go with the flow. He had never questioned himself or why he was making the choices that would dictate his life. Richie was questioning his love for Kelly, his attraction to her, and the moments they shared. He never had any conviction that things were as good as they seemed, but this is when something had caught Richie's eye. Mid-flight, a man was walking upstairs to the upper deck, and this stuck out to him. This was odd. There is no way seats were being exchanged or upgraded right now, and there were plenty of facilities and services available down below. Richie tells us that questioning his life, his proposal to Kelly, was the last coherent thought he remembers from that day, because after that, all he remembers is panic. We then see the man walk through the aisle with a slight grin on his face that is slowly turning into a frown. His mouth is slightly open, as though he's carrying something inside it. Richie then spots the blood at the corner of his mouth, and Richie remembers that he was in sheer disbelief at that moment. He was calling himself deluded until the man had opened his mouth. Blood pours out of the man's mouth as the younger Richie tries to come to terms with the fact that the man is carrying a pair of ripped-off testicles in his mouth. This is when the modern-day Richie decides to hold back from telling us more about his past for now. He just tells us that once he laid his eyes on such a horrific sight, his heart and stomach both were in freefall. He tells us that in that freefall, it was all chaos. Images, hands, limbs, metal plastic, shouts, screams, everything passed his eyes and his ears each second. Through this infinite plummeting descent, Richie tells us that during this freefall, he caught on to the only thing he knew, himself, and it would take a year for him to realize that his survival wasn't by chance. It was because this is who he was, a survivor. But while Richie is telling us this, we see him keep a close eye on all the survivors in his group. He looks at them with disdain and mistrust. Something is brewing inside Richie, something he feels will need to come to fruition very soon. Crossed Dead or Alive, issue number 2. Threat assessment. It is now nighttime and Richie is looking at burning flames through his binoculars. Even though he is supposed to be looking far away, his eyes are closely focused on the group he is traveling with. And this is when Richie reveals his plan to us. He tells us that he is going to have to get rid of all of them if he is meant to survive this apocalypse. He tells us that he has thought long and hard about this, assessed every possible outcome, studied each and every person thoroughly enough, and he has come to this conclusion after pondering over it for weeks. And sadly, the conclusion is that none of them are worthy to survive alongside him. Not just a few, all of them. He tells us that they are by no means friends, neither in the traditional sense, nor in the twisted sense the Crossed now force people to be. Yes, they have saved each other's lives a couple of times, but that is now part of the package for a group in these times. It's the extended self-preservation, because no one wants to spend their lives alone in these times. Richie then tells us that all of the people in this group are so different from each other that if the C virus outbreak hadn't happened, then he is sure that they would have never ever met each other in real life. And even if they had come across each other before the outbreak, none of them would have spoken to each other. He tells us that even after having saved each other multiple times, it hasn't created even an iota of affection amongst them. It hasn't sparked any form of respect, because everyone knows that anybody could be killed at any second. No one is dumb enough to talk about sticking with each other through thick and thin, because the way things are, you could be burying the guy standing next to you the very next day. Or worse, you'd be forced to run away from him. We see the group is composed of 7 people in total, including Richie. Richie is currently looking back at the group while a similarly battle-hardened man beside him uses the binoculars to keep a close eye on the fire Richie was looking at previously. The disdain in Richie's eyes for his fellow survivors is as clear as day. He then says, "I have no problem betraying them all before they get me killed, or worse, before one of them has the same idea and beats me to the punch." We then see that the group of survivors has been keeping a close eye on a huge bonfire lit by the Crossed in the town below, a mile or 2 away from them. The man keeping a close eye on the Crossed alongside Richie is Carl. Carl is the unsaid leader of the group, and he has been insisting on waiting for the Crossed to leave the town. They have been waiting for hours, and Carl and the rest of them desperately want to scour the town for supplies, but the Crossed are simply refusing to leave. They found a survivor and his 2 children in the town, and they are taking their own sweet time torturing and violating the man. We then see the Crossed dancing and jumping around the huge fire while a couple of them violate the man on top of a car. A discussion then ensues between Carl and Richie as they plan the group's next move. Richie wants to move on, but Carl wants to stay and wait the Crossed out so that they can gather supplies. The group is low on everything: food, water, and more. Richie feels that if they are to survive, then they need to put as much space as possible between them and the Crossed. But Carl goes on to remind him that this is the last town they will come across before they head off into the Rockies for this season. However, that is when Carl spots most of the Crossed hunker down and begin feasting on something. As Carl gets a closer look, he realizes that the Crossed are eating the man's children piece by piece. Although Carl has seen a lot, this sight is too much for him. He stops stops looking, but Richie continues to stare through his binoculars. He tries to lift up Carl's spirits by telling him that most of the crossed look malnourished and infected with multiple diseases. He theorizes that most of them will succumb to scurvy, AIDS and such diseases very soon. Carl leaves Richie to keep an eye on the crossed, and at this moment Richie feels sorry for the other survivors, but he is hell-bent on doing what needs to be done. He tells us that this isn't the old world anymore. No longer are there different states of being. It's really simple. You're either dead or alive. There's nothing more than that, and most people will choose being alive because the third state that exists right now is something they don't even want to think about. And when Richie says this, we see the father's body stir back to life, and he lifts his head with a maniacal smile on his face. He is missing a few teeth and an eye, but now there is a huge red crossed rash on his face. This is the third state of being in this world, the state everyone is running from. Crossed Dead or Alive issue number 3, a dangerous game to play. And so the third comic begins by showing us what Richie had been predicting and fearing all this while. The survivors succumb to the threats and obstacles while holding on to the human values that, according to him, need to be let go in these times. They never got the chance to scour the town for supplies, and so they are now forced to melt ice in order to replenish their water supplies. The survivors are smart though. They use a small portable propane stove that produces a fire that doesn't burn bright, but it burns hot. Richie watches on as the older woman in the group melts down ice patiently and fills up each and everyone's bottle. Richie tells us that by this time he has grown to hate the group, grown to hate each and everyone around him. And this, running out of water, resorting to what he had said in the first place but not earlier, this only makes it worse. Not worse for Richie, but worse for them. This makes it easier for Richie to see them as enemies. It makes it easier for him to hate them all. He then sighs and looks at the Rockies as he tries to grasp onto the little good that remains in the world. He takes solace in the fact that at least his group of survivors has decided on a decent destination, because the rest of the places, south or the deserts, have been overrun by the crossed. This is juxtaposed by the crossed wreaking havoc in Los Angeles. Richie tells us that most of the crossed patrol the coast of the United States like a swarm of locusts. He tells us that they keep going up and down the coast while annihilating anything that stands in their way. As he says this, we see a bunch of crazy crossed tear through the Hollywood sign and leap down below into the valley. As Richie stops looking at the mountains and turns back towards his group, we see that the old woman has now finished melting the ice. She is now evenly distributing the water into every bottle with the help of one other survivor. Even in this moment, Richie loathes them all for not realizing that they could be drinking an age-old parasite in this boiled water and risking their lives. He then tells us that he has assessed and played out every scenario in his head over the past few days. He has thought of ways to try and get either of the survivors to survive alongside him in the plan that is brewing in his head. But he tells that all has been futile. Each scenario ends the same way, and neither one of them are worthy of accompanying him into the future. He then starts introducing us to the survivors one by one. The next page is dedicated to the old woman that was boiling water for the group. Richie tells us that her name is Tabitha, and she is among the people he loathes the most in the group. He tells us that she is too polite, too generous, and that is what uneases him about her. It is what throws him off. The fact that she has never shared the story of how she survived the C virus outbreak only adds to the mystery. He says that in all his time surviving, every survivor he has ever met ends up telling their story. It might take days or weeks, but it eventually pours out. After all, if anyone has managed to survive this long, they are likely to have done some unsavory things, and confession only makes it living with what you've done easier. But Tabitha, she somehow has managed to defy this rule. She hasn't told her story to anyone, let alone the group. Richie then adds her age to all of this. The fact that her age is getting to her, and the fact that she doesn't have more to live for anyways. These are the reasons she is a failure in his book. He then tells us about Carl. Carl is an old retired Marine that tries to hold on to the ways of the army in these dark times. He tells us that Carl has saved their lives numerous times, that his skills of war have come in handy ever since the group met him. Yet Carl has his own flaws. He is still lost in his own world of the armed forces. He still believes that his brethren might have taken steps to aid their survival, that armed forces still might be out there hatching a plan to aid humanity. Richie then tells us that apart from all these flaws, Carl has another one, a fatal flaw, a flaw that has almost gotten all of them killed. killed more times than he can count. Carl still believes in the value, no man gets left behind. This value of his has endangered the entire group on numerous instances, and this is something Richie can't tolerate. According to him, survival starts by being selfish, especially in these times. While the crossed are out there, such values only make a person weak, and these are the reasons why Carl is also a failure in his book. He then introduces us to the third member of the group, Joe, a former police officer. He tells us that Joe has frankly been a godsend for the survivors. He is skilled with guns and has been trained for survival in dark times. He is good with his hands, and more often than not, Joe can easily handle most situations. Yet this is where Joe's good qualities end for Richie and the bad ones begin. He tells us that one of the biggest flaws that Joe has is the same one that Carl does. He is of the so-called alpha mind. He believes in duty, determination, intervening in situations that rarely need interference. And all of this makes Joe hold on to values that no longer matter in the world they currently inhabit and will inhabit for the rest of their lives. He tells us that this is why Joe has let his obsession for guns take over him. Even in these darkest times, Joe is adamant on everyone using the correct terms, differentiating between pistols and revolvers, learning and calling each caliber correctly, and most of all, following the correct firearm etiquette. Richie tells us that he can hear Joe in his sleep whenever he closes his eyes, and all Joe says is, both hands on the weapon, fingers off the triggers, empty chamber under the hammer, you don't want it going off in your pants. And this is why Richie hates him, because despite all this discipline, all this knowledge, Joe is in the same boat as all of them. His failure to see this fact is what makes Joe a failure in Richie's books. But this is when the introductions to the group need to pause for now, because Carl has just spotted movement in the tree line below them in the valley. Richie quickly jumps into action, pulls out his set of binoculars and tries to corroborate Carl's claims. Their worst nightmare comes true when Carl spots multiple crossed. What's worse is that they all seem to be on the group's trail. Despite all their efforts, they might have missed something which would have tipped off the crossed to the group's presence. Carl loses hope when he gets a good look at the group pursuing them. There are at least 50 of them, too many to fight against, which leaves the only other choice of running away into the mountains while hoping that the crossed succumb to the environment. Carl then sighs and reveals the truth to the entire group, that the crossed are following the same trail they all took 10 miles back, and they all seem to be gaining ground rather quickly. This is when Richie's head twitches and the plan begins to itch in the back of his brain again. He tells us that this might be a too dangerous game to play for the group. This is when we get a good look at the group of the crossed pursuing them. They seem to be smarter than the feral crossed we or the group has encountered in the past. They seem to have a leader, and the leader seems to have some sort of control over them. He even walks two of the feral crossed, held by leashes, as though they are his pet dogs. Crossed dead or alive. Issue number 4, Betrayed by Your Own Kind. We catch up with the group now way high up in the Rockies. All of them follow after one another like zombies, none of them truly talking or speaking more than they need to. Everybody is lost in their minds, and this only gives Richie an opportunity to assess and form his plan further. Thankfully, he isn't busy plotting their downfall, but hoping and wishing for snow. The crossed group that is hot on their trail has been gaining ground, which is why Richie is hoping for it to snow so that it can reduce their numbers. As the group continues into the mountains, Richie tells us that only snow can help them, and he knows that the entire group is wishing for the same. It is a stretch at best, hoping and wishing that the crossed succumb to the elements while you continue running from them. It would have been suicide if not for the Rockies and the terrain they are in. We then get a glimpse of the crossed group hot on their heels. They are ecstatic and in a frenzy to find the group. Richie then tells us a fact that we as crossed comic fans have come to know since the beginning, that once the crossed know that a survivor is nearby, once they catch onto a scent or clue, they don't stop chasing. They won't stop if they get a disease. They won't stop if they're shot. They won't stop if they're dismembered. It's just that they won't stop till they get to you. Richie tells us that the nightmare he has imagined all this while is getting closer. He can feel it, and though the group is hoping for the crossed group to weed itself out, he knows it isn't happening soon enough. And Richie might be right. We see a handicapped crossed with makeshift makeshift crutches get left behind, but the rest of their numbers continue to chase after the group, and even the crossed that is left behind can't help but smile as his kind chases the group. As Richie overthinks all of this, he begins to panic visibly, and his words make it seem like he's breaking down. Richie puts his hand up to his forehead as he visualizes the supposed future that awaits him. Oh, and before I continue, just a small request. If you have liked the video thus far, please consider subscribing to us. It may be a small click for you, but it helps us in tremendous ways to keep bringing you these marvelous long reads. And now, let's continue. A future where he and the rest of the group will be dragged down one by one. They will slowly run out of ammunition. They will then eventually be exhausted and finally overwhelmed. Once that happens, there will be grasping claws ripping their skin, tearing their clothes, all the while laughing out loudly, and then it ends. And if it doesn't, then comes the worst part, because you turn and become one of them. Richie is sweating profusely now. He is visibly shaken and his eyes are darting in every direction, but he is then able to contain his panic. He is able to avoid the panic attack by blaming the group once again. He blames the group for putting him in this situation, for condemning themselves and him to eventual death at the hands of the crossed. Richie blames them for not realizing that all of them are simply playing a game and waiting to see who gets picked off first by the crossed. He then justifies himself by saying that what he has been planning for months now seems to be the right choice more than ever. The group always does this, plays with all their lives, gambles with Richie's, and so no wonder they deserve what Richie has planned for them. Richie then resumes introducing us to the rest of the group. According to Richie, Lauren is the femme fatale of the group, someone he desperately crushes on in secret. He wishes he could take Lauren with him once he enacts his plan, wishes that the two of them could be alone and live out the rest of their lives like rekindling lost lovers. Richie tells us that she has been a subject of his fantasies for quite a while now, yet he knows that she hates him in the real world. She took one look at him and Richie knew she hated him from that moment. Richie says that even though she has recovered since the first day she saw him and has tried to act nice ever since, he knows that he reminds her of someone she used to know, someone she hates. He then tells us, despite all this, he knows Lauren will bring him down if he lets her survive. She has no survival skill, and though she has learned to use a gun and clean it over the past few months, he knows she hates it. Every time Richie has watched her clean the gun, he has noticed her handle it like a poisonous snake, as though she is still repulsed by it. Because of all this, she is a failure in his book. We are then introduced to Justin, someone Richie truly hates and loathes. Justin is jumpy, easily startled, and scared of his own shadow. Richie confesses that Justin's mere presence awakens a loathing of human inadequacy he never knew that he possessed. Richie tells us that Justin likes playing the victim card to fool everyone, yet despite that, Richie has always been able to see through his lies. Richie deep down knows that Justin has survived the outbreak and all the time that has passed since by staying out of sight, by staying in the shadows, and by never drawing attention to himself. He then tells us that the entire group has secretly voted for Justin to be the most likely one to betray them when opportunity arises, something Richie himself is planning to do. So no wonder he's a failure in Richie's book. But what Richie fails to notice when describing Justin is that he might be projecting. He might be jealous of Justin, and his loathing might be a reflection of how he feels about himself. We are then introduced to Luke, someone Richie sympathizes with, yet he knows Luke isn't an asset in these times. He tells us that Luke has the most devastating story of them all. The day of the outbreak broke him, and everything that has happened since then has only chipped away at his being. Richie tells us that each day he can see Luke wishing for death, praying that something takes him, and yet Richie doesn't understand why Luke won't just do it himself. Either way, Luke is a failure in Richie's view, and that's the end of introductions, and Richie's justifications to why these people can't stay with him and follow him into the future. Justification of why he is going to betray them. But that is when Richie is snapped out of his thoughts with Carl swearing, and soon everyone from the group follows, and all Richie can say once he lays his eyes on the sight in front of him is, "Well, that's just great. That's just wonderful." We are then shown what has halted all the survivors dead in their tracks. The bridge that they were supposed to take further into the mountains is no longer intact. It has been blown apart, and they are now trapped with death on either end of their path. On one end are the crossed, while on the other end is at least a 500-foot drop to the death. And this is when Richie's panic attack begins again, but Richie can't express it, so he avoids reacting. But he tells us that it feels like the ground is rumbling underneath him. It's as if thousands of engines are firing at once inside his head, and all he can do right now, after feeling this way way is say, "You stupid shits, all of you. I want to fucking kill all of you." Crossed, dead or alive. Issue number 5, incessant justifications. And so we catch up with our survivors looking down into the valley. It's not like they are at this bridge for the first time. It is a bridge that they have traversed numerous times, which is why they are now trying to figure out how it was destroyed. Carl and Tabitha are looking down into the river below as Carl informs everyone that the bridge was likely intentionally blown apart by someone that didn't want to be followed. It was likely done by someone who hadn't turned yet. As we get a glimpse into the river below, we get a good look at the rubble. The bridge has been disintegrated thoroughly. None of the asphalt is recognizable, and what remains of the metal hints at excessive destruction. Carl speculates that whoever it was possessed military-grade explosives, and Joe joins in the conversation by telling all of them that he had heard that the military was tasked with taking out most major routes, highways, and bridges between the eastern and western parts of the country. As most of them continue discussing the destroyed bridge, Richie's panic gets to him, and he interrupts them all by saying, "Is this relevant right now?" Everyone is shocked by this, but they try to understand his urgency. Richie looks towards the ground, clearly affected by all the eyes that turn to him, taunting him for a solution, now that he has the audacity to interrupt them so shamelessly, but he has none. Tabitha is the first one to speak, as though trying to save Richie from this situation by asking others for possible solutions and what they can do now. But Richie turns on Tabitha because it seems that blaming others is all he can do to cope with his shortcomings. Joe suggests that they can go back and into the woods or head down into the valley, though the slope is quite steep. Tabitha agrees by saying that most of them won't be able to manage the slope, but this is when Richie latches onto her words. He thinks that Tabitha is doing her best to avoid the valley because she is an old woman that can't traverse the terrain, which is why she is endangering them all further by suggesting the only other choice, which is to head into the woods. Justin and Lauren are clearly distraught by this decision, but Carl tells them that they need to get going right now because they will be closing the distance between them and the Crossed before they veer into the woods. Richie stands far away from the group in a defensive stance, contemplating all the obstacles that will lie in their wake if they choose the woods. Bad visibility, rough terrain, and slowed travel speed. He knows that it won't be long before one of them is injured, which is bound to slow the group down even more. The group, however, is ignoring these risks that come with this choice. He tells us that he is familiar with this state of the mind. It's the same one that the flight attendant was in when he tried to confront the crossed man when he showed up from the lower deck of the as young Richie watched on in horror. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." Richie remembers that even that day, after having seen what the man had in his mouth, neither the flight attendant nor him were ready to accept this reality, and so they simply tried ignoring him. The flight attendant tried offering the man medical assistance, but he just stood there like a dummy, standing there as the attendant closed the distance between himself and the man. He remembers panic slowly growing inside the cabin as Kelly once again began to hound him, whine at him for answers. "Richie, what is it, Richie? Richie, what is it?" And that is when the unthinkable happened. The man held the attendant by the throat and simply spit the testicles that he was carrying in his mouth into the flight attendant's face. Everyone around Richie recoiled in horror as he felt Kelly trying to curl up into his arms. Richie watched in horror as the attack continued, and all the female flight attendant could do was jump onto the infected man's back in order to choke him. But that is when hell broke loose, because 2 more infected showed up on the upper deck while shouting obscenities. We then see Kelly beg, hound, and scream at Richie for answers, and he simply unbuckles his seatbelt in response. At this point in his memory, Richie tells us that he is sure that Kelly thought he was going to join the fight. She likely loved him so much that she thought he was going to save them all. But that is when the memory shows us what happened next, and Richie refrains from his commentary. The plane lurches sideways, and anyone that wasn't buckled in is thrown out of their seats, including Richie. We then see why this happened. Someone on the lower deck had managed to open the emergency door. We see the plane fly off into the night while leaving a trail of flying bodies in its wake, most of them alive, some infected and others human. We then see Richie get launched in the upper cabin and hit multiple surfaces. As this happens, Richie confesses how he felt that day. In that moment is exactly how he feels right now as he heads into the woods with his group. He knows, feels, and has the urge. It's something he has always known about himself, the feeling that he would do anything to survive. Modern day Richie's head is hung low as we see the young Richie in the memory watch in horror as the crossed man crawls his way towards him. Crossed, Dead or Alive. Issue number 6, Machinations of a Paranoid Mind. Richie continues telling us about his memory, how while he was on the floor of the upper deck, he could hear and comprehend all of the chaos around him. Screams coming from the deck below, crashing and smashing drinking carts everywhere, the slamming of the cockpit door, and most of all, the first flight attendant desperately trying to clear his throat of what was spit in his face. But what Richie remembers the most is the sound of coughing and retching quickly turning into laughter, maniacal, incessant laughter. This is when he is snapped out of the memory and into the present day. Lauren has been in charge of keeping an eye on their backs, and sadly she has just spotted movement in the trees. She lowers her head as she reveals this to everyone. She is sure she saw movement in the last valley they crossed, and this sadly puts the crossed not even 5 miles away from them. This is when Richie's memory begins again, as we see the crossed man reaching out for young Richie, commanding and ordering him to hand over his eyes as though it was some material possession. But this is when gravity came to young Richie's rescue. The plane hit turbulence and they were all launched into the air and in different directions once again. The crossed man ended up getting his head slammed into the floor while Richie was launched into a woman's lap. She desperately screamed for him to get off of her, while modern-day Richie tells us that all that he was wishing for in that moment was utter and complete blackness, an end to all of this. He was praying for death. This is when the male flight attendant that was spat in the face named Hector was approached by the female attendant as she tried to check on him, but by now, Hector had been turned, yet none of them knew what this meant back then. His incessant obscenities simply seemed like the reactions of a sane human after what they had just been put through. Richie was still upside down in the woman's lap as he watched all of this unfold in front of him, because the next second, Hector spun around and picked the flight attendant up by the neck. However, Richie tells us that surprises don't space them out in life. They either come all at once or take their sweet time to show up, because the very next second, a bullet came whizzing through the air, entered the left side of Hector's head, and exited out of the right side with a huge, gory explosion. The rest of the infected were then quickly shot down, and it was all thanks to the pilot who had come to their rescue. Richie tells us that at that point in time he thought the pilot was shooting everyone out of sheer panic. But now that he looks back, he realizes that the pilot was being level-headed and calculative. He only shot the infected while avoiding the innocent. As Richie remembers this memory, he can see things through the captain's eyes. All he would have known about was the commotion in the lower deck. Then he had to deal with the depressurization of the lower cabin, as well as the turbulence. Once that was done, he would have had to investigate the thud against the cockpit door, which is why he took his time to retrieve the gun from its locker. Richie says that all of this might just be speculation. The pilot could have been simply panicking, and he lucked out by shooting the infected with his first couple of shots, because Richie remembers that the gun was pointed at him next, and he had to beg for his life. Thankfully, the pilot had stopped and his adrenaline was slowly being released in the form of sweat from his body. The pilot had gone on to tell Richie that they will be making an emergency landing, but he needs to do the pilot a favor. They have lost contact with the lower deck, and Richie needs to go and check what's going on below. As Richie remembers this, he tells us that if he knew what the pilot was asking of him, what he was using him for, Richie wouldn't have followed through. But then again, nobody back then knew what the crossed were. Richie remembers stupidly asking the pilot for the gun to ensure his safety, and all the pilot had said in return was, "Don't be a cunt." Richie thinks that not taking the gun to the lower decks was the best idea, because what he saw would have made him shoot himself in the head instantly. The entire deck below was painted in red, a nightmare scenario of people indulging in violence and depravity, spitting, vomiting on each other, beating each other to death with anything in hand, including their own newborns. Richie remembers sitting on the stairs, keeping out of sight as his legs buckled and his entire body responded with utter and complete failure at the sight of such violence. But then, Richie is snapped out of this memory after he hears a loud crunch, a snap, and then a loud guttural scream by Justin. Richie loathes Justin at this moment, hates him with everything he has, because not only had Justin stuck his foot into a rabbit hole and snapped his ankle, he had let out a scream that would be heard for miles, a scream that would have definitely reached the crossed hot on their trail. Crossed Dead or Alive, issue number 7. Betrayals. Joe and Tabitha are attending to Justin, who thankfully seems to be better than everyone had suspected. He doesn't seem to have broken anything and is still able to move his foot. Despite this respite, Richie can't help but look back at Justin with hatred-filled eyes. Not only that, Richie ends up blurting, "This is so fucking dumb." Carl is well aware of how Richie feels, and he is more than caught up on Richie's opinion. Yet he is just as Richie had described him. Carl leaves no man behind. He is currently aiming down the sights of his rifle, keeping an eye out, while Richie, meanwhile, is loathing the group's choice of supporting Justin and dragging him along. The Crossed are closer than ever, and Justin's sprained foot is only going to hinder their speed further. According to Richie, the logical thing to do right now would be to leave Justin behind so that the Crossed have something to play with, which would give them all enough time to make their escape. But he knows that none of them will do this. As he lives through this, he is once again reminded of his time on the plane. How the same strategy of helping the weak, according to him, cost the pilot that saved them all his life. The plane is nearing the airport where they are supposed to make their emergency landing, while young Richie is walking upstairs to report what he found in the lower deck. All he can tell the pilot is that none of them should be going down there and that they should be doing everything in their power to prevent anyone from coming up. The pilot, meanwhile, is consoling the air hostess that just saw Hector get shot through the head right in front of her eyes. Her name is Cassie, and the pilot is trying to console her by saying that they should be landing the plane within the next few minutes. But that is when, according to Richie, this moment of weakness from the captain gets him ambushed, because no matter how many times the captain calls out to Cassie, she doesn't respond. When she finally looks up, she has the crossed rash on her face. Cassie is awfully calm, but when she opens her mouth, young Richie's suspicions are confirmed. She says, "Think God's gonna fuck us all." The next second, Cassie lunges at the pilot and grabs his gun. She then overpowers him, points the gun under his chin and pulls the trigger without remorse. Young Richie is watching all of this happen while completely frozen in his place. By the time he manages to force himself to move, it's already too late. Infected Cassie is now running towards the open cockpit, while all young Richie can hear are the cries of the other passengers urging him to stop her. But all Richie can do is think about his own survival. He watches Cassie walk up to the other two pilots and blow their brains out, and young Richie in return sits down on his seat and straps himself in. The other passengers can only look on in shock and horror as the very next second, the airplane crashes into a nearby building and then begins mowing down houses as its momentum starts slowing down. Cars and rubble is being thrown in all directions while the engines catch fire. Richie tells us that in that moment, his mind forced him to rush for the door, to open it and get out no matter what height or the consequence. And this is exactly what young Richie did. While people around him were getting dismembered and were begging for help, young Richie was beelining it for the door. We then see that the plane is now screeching to a halt. It has lost one of its wings, while the other one, meanwhile, is on fire. Richie says that the passengers began screaming as soon as the fire spread inside the cabin, but nothing mattered to him at that moment. Richie tells us that he lost 2 fingernails while trying to unbuckle himself, but he knows that he would have happily sacrificed an arm as well if it meant his own survival. As young Richie reaches the plane's door, he hears a familiar voice call out to him, the voice of Kelly. And in the present day, what Richie feared has finally happened. Carl has spotted movement in the trees and the fight is about to begin. We see Richie's eyes flicker with hatred as Carl informs this to the rest of the group. Crossed Dead or Alive, issue number 8. And so it begins like it had. Richie continues his memory of the plane crash, and we see young Richie fall out of the plane after opening the door. The plane has now come to a halt, and thankfully, the fire hasn't yet reached this area. Even at that moment, young Richie's brain was working overtime. He could feel the fire rapidly spreading around him, and he knew that it would reach the fuel tanks any moment now. He knew he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and the crash. But that is when something unexpected happened. He was greeted by a flight attendant, standing outside, motionless, and asking if he was okay. And then young Richie realized that the flight attendant wasn't talking to him. She was talking to someone on the ground. She was asking the person on the ground to focus because she needed his help if they were to escape. When she said, "It's important that you pay attention," that is the moment young Richie looked down at her feet and realized that she had none. She had no feet and was somehow standing on her stumps while they bled. And Richie in the present day tells us that that was the moment his younger self realized that only his survival mattered now. As a man on fire rushed into the vastness of the crash behind him, young Richie realized that he had to save himself no matter what it took. And this realization, combined with the horrid scene in front of him, made him piss his pants. And we are then shown who the flight attendant was talking to. It was another flaming man on the ground, burning to death right in front of her eyes. Richie didn't know it then, but everyone around him was in shock, suffering from delusions while thriving on pure adrenaline. But then, young Richie heard it. From under a flaming pile of flesh, bones and metal, he heard the laugh that he would come to dread till this date, the maniacal laugh of a Crost. Richie watched in horror as the Crost began to crawl out of the flames, demanding Richie's death. And Richie tells us that it was the final moment to make him prioritize himself over anyone else. In the present day, we see a Crost getting shot in the chest twice, while Carl takes the charge. Carl, Richie, Lauren and Luke are shooting at the Crost in tight formation while making sure they miss none. They are buying the others enough time to get Justin moving so that they can make their escape. They take down the current pack of the Crost without a hitch, but Lauren tells them that's not all of them. They split into two groups earlier, and this is the first one. After hearing these shots, the other group is bound to be making their way here. That is when Carl is told that they are done patching up Justin and should now be able to continue their journey. But that is when Carl decides that he and Richie will stay here and hold the other pack back while giving the group enough time to make their escape. Luke and Lauren make their way, while Richie somberly reloads his gun without saying a word. But inside Richie is boiling with anger as he says, "No, no, no, fuck you, Carl. You just made this into now or never." And when he thinks these words to himself, we see Richie look up at Carl with anger dripping from his eyes. Crossed Dead or Alive, issue number 9, Karma. We see young Richie running away from the crash while firefighters rush in the opposite direction. Richie tells us that the kid in him wanted to warn the firefighters of what he had seen, but he knew no one would believe him, and he was prioritizing himself now. And so young Richie simply ran away and saved his own life. In the present day, Carl and Richie are scouting for the second group of the Crossed while trying to stay hidden. Sadly, Richie is too lost in his memory, which is why he fails to notice Carl silently raising his fist, a sign that means they have to stop. But Richie simply continues walking in a daze, and Carl is forced to snap him out of it. He angrily whispers at Richie to listen to his instructions and then holds him by the collar and warns him not to make the same mistake again. Richie in this moment is completely startled and taken aback, but the next very second he is more determined than ever to carry out his plan now. Carl has just antagonized himself in Richie's eyes, and this is going to make it a lot easier for Richie to enact what he has planned. The two of them sit on top of a ridge while Carl keeps an eye out using his binoculars. Carl is reporting everything he is seeing, but Richie is lost in his thoughts again, preparing himself for what needs to be done. Then Carl ends up spotting the second group of the Crossed, and Richie knows that this is his chance. Carl will now be too focused on the Crossed to notice him and Richie's right, because Carl fails to notice him get up. He tries to continue the conversation with Carl while continuing to recount his story of the crash. Richie tells us that the night was turned to day when the plane finally exploded that day. He says, "The blast atomized the plane, atomized the town and its people. It shook the earth, and I stood up through the vast concussive blast, through searing heat and all-devouring horror." We then get a glimpse at young Richie looking at the blast, suffering from concussions and bleeding from his nose. The town around him has been completely decimated as Richie continues to say, "In that moment after the blast, I knew what I was. I was a survivor." And as Richie says this, he does what he has been meaning to do all this while. He takes the butt of his rifle and hits Carl in the jaw as hard as he can. Ominously, we are then taken to catch up with the survivors. Justin seems to be doing better than expected and is even able to limp on his own without Joe's help. Lauren and Tabitha, meanwhile, are keeping a lookout for Carl and Richie, but there hasn't been any sign of them yet. Tabitha quickly catches on. She knows Carl is smart. He wouldn't have waited this long to catch up with them, and the lack of shots means that they didn't encounter any Crossed. She looks at Lauren mysteriously, and it seems that she is putting two and two together. Richie, meanwhile, is making his escape after knocking out Carl. He tells us that after all these months, he finally feels free, finally feels like he's doing the right thing. He tells us that this is who he has been. This is what he has always done. Stick with the dumb survivors until the perfect opportunity to ditch them arises. He is too busy reveling in his victory and fails to notice that he is running towards his doom. The dense forest cover makes it hard for him to spot it while running, and by the time he notices his mistake, it's already too late. Richie has been running without paying attention, and he has just run himself off of a cliff, too lost and enamored by his own short-lived victory. But even in this moment, while falling to his death, all Richie can do is chide himself for his mistake of not looting Carl, not taking his gun and supplies. Crossed dead or alive. Issue number 10. Self-realization. Welp, this is it for Richie. He is lying at the bottom of the cliff, sitting at the edge of the river while staring at the broken bone sticking out of his left knee. Even at this moment, Richie is simply staring and planning. He plans to simply set his bone like shown in the movies and then splint it. Once that is done, he should be able to heal and survive again. Richie takes a huge breath and then tries to set his bone, but the moment he touches it, the worst kind of searing pain burns through his entire body, and he screams at the top of his lungs. His scream echoes throughout the entire forest, only to be further amplified by the valley. And so, at this moment, Richie's world begins to unravel. He begins to realize that he never really felt something in his life. He truly never felt any feeling apart from indifference. Richie remembers his father's funeral, and we see him standing there, motionless and emotionless, while his mother clings onto his hand, using his shoulder for support. He tells us that when his mother had asked him if he would miss his father, he had replied that of course he would. But now that he is lying at the bottom of a cliff with his bones sticking out of his knee, he can see the truth clearly, because even in that moment, Richie was feeling nothing but hate and contempt for his mother. He felt that his mother squeezed his hand too tightly and hung onto his shoulder for too long. The young him could never understand why she needed to do that now that a day had passed and everybody had accepted that his father had died. And then Richie tells us about the next question his mother asked. Will you miss him, Richie? And Richie's answer was, I guess so. And these 3 words, I guess so, are what defines Richie's past before the C virus outbreak. He confesses now that when, after the funeral, his Uncle Al had proclaimed that the death of his father would hit him soon, Richie had hoped that it would. He wanted to believe that he was in shock, but that world-shaking realization never came. Richie never truly felt anything after his father had passed away. Richie tells us in the present, nothing ever quite got through. I wonder why that was. No deep-down traumas. No hardships or fights to overcome. Life wasn't perfect, but it wasn't difficult either. As Richie contemplates and wonders this, we see him lying on the stone solemnly with his eyes turned towards the sky and dried blood smeared at the edge of his mouth. He then remembers the day of the plane crash and continues the story where it left off, with Richie standing in the now devastated town as the lone survivor. He feels the same way in the present as he did back then, while staring out at all the chaos and the devastation. He tells us that he never truly felt love, and now, in this moment when he's seeing the truth about all the important moments of his life, he knows that he never loved Kelly. But it wasn't that he faked it. In fact, he was invested in her. He would voluntarily picture them getting married each day after the proposal. But this fall to his death has brought along a revelation. Because Richie now realizes why he pictured the day of their marriage again and again, it's because he was concerned if he would be able to fake a convincing enough smile on the big day or not. He then realizes that he has lived all his life by 3 words. He has answered the most important questions of his life with only these 3 words. I guess so. Will you miss him, Richie? I guess so. Do you love me, Richie? I guess so. So you want to marry my daughter, young man? I guess so. Do you take this woman, etc., etc.? I guess so. He remembers that these 3 words rang in his head like a church bell when he walked away from the destroyed town that night and headed into the woods all by himself. He now realizes that his father's death never affected him or shocked him, and the easiest thing in his life has always been walking away from such devastating events to ensure his own survival. But the thing that led him to the bottom of this cliff is about to be his downfall, because once again, Richie has been distracted in his memories to notice that something has been approaching him, and now that he sees movement in his periphery, he knows that it's already too late. He grunts and scoots. He tries to crawl towards his gun, but his broken leg holds him back. He stretches his hand, but it's not enough. The gun is just inches away from his fingertips, and Richie is pushing his entire body to get to it in time. And then it finally happens. His hand grazes the stock of the gun, and he manages to grab hold of it. He tries to steady his mind, tries to tell himself that in this situation, the only way to save yourself is to put the gun in your mouth and pull the trigger. But then, when he looks back up to take a one last look at the source of movement movement, he doesn't see the crossed. Instead, the group of survivors he betrayed an hour ago is standing there. Everyone is here. Lauren, Joe, Justin, Tabitha, Luke, and most of all, Carl. Somehow, through some miracle, Carl has survived, and when Richie lays his eyes on him for the first time in his life, he and his brain both are speechless. Crossed dead or alive. Issue number 11. You're not the only observer. Joe and Lauren bend down and begin going through Richie's bag, and what they find makes them disgusted. While the entire group was struggling for basic supplies, Richie was hoarding things they hadn't seen in ages. They find his bag full of toilet paper, cinnamon, chocolate, and something called berry cinno. Lauren and Joe both swear as they continue finding things that even back in the day would have been considered luxurious. They find a book of matches, caramel, spicy pear, and more exotic goodies. It's as though Richie's their Santa, and it's Christmas for them in the middle of November. All Richie can do is look on with bewilderment at them and the entire group. He glances between all the members until he is finally able to open his mouth and blurt out, "You're fucking looting me!" And it is Tabitha who engages him, the one he found the least likely candidate to survive, the one chalked up as a failure the moment he started assessing the group. She says, "You left Carl behind to keep the crossed occupied, left the rest of us minus a rear guard. So yes, of course yes, we're looting you." Carl then bends down, gets awfully close to Richie's face and says, "Would you like to take a guess at what I wanted to do, Richie boy?" He grits his teeth, and though Carl has bandages across his entire head, the sheer anger that he feels is easily able to seep from his lips and into Richie's skin. We then see that the entire group is meticulous while carrying out this confrontation. Luke is keeping an eye on their surroundings, while Justin is making sure that he has a good view of the situation. And because Carl is now face to face with him, Richie begins to shake with fear. He never expected to meet these people again, let alone be confronted by Carl just hours later, and that too while he was struggling with a broken leg. He tries to lie, tries to apologize to Carl, but naturally nobody believes a word Richie is saying. Carl knows that this was all planned by Richie, and they all could see the hatred he felt for all of them in his eyes. But that is when Richie tries to save the situation by saying, No, I mean when Justin broke his ankle. That's what made me go down the wrong path. I heard the snap, I freaked out. I thought if we let him slow us down, we'd all get killed. I mean, you were all helping him, and the crossed were right behind us." But that is when another revelation that has been awaiting Richie all this while comes to fruition. Justin joins the conversation and says, "It isn't broken. There was no snap, Richie, but you've never liked me or the rest of us. You just heard what you hoped you would, because you couldn't wait to get rid of me and the rest of us." Justin looks into the distance as though battling disappointment, and that is when Tabitha takes over the confrontation against Richie. She tells him that the entire group knew something was off about him. They all could see it in his eyes. Richie always had that weird look. They all had a feeling that Richie was only sticking with the group until it served his purpose. She crosses her arms as she tells Richie that she was the first one to figure it out. The first one to figure out that Richie was just waiting for an opportunity to ditch them. It is why she got suspicious the moment Carl didn't return back to the group on time while he was off with Richie. Carl scoffs, spits on the ground, while Joe joins the confrontation to ask Richie the impending question. He asks Richie, "This wasn't the first time, was it, Richie? What happened to your last group? Did you just ditch them or serve them to the crossed on a silver platter?" Richie is now shaking to his core, and his every word is now dripping with denial. He tries to deny their allegations, tries to deny his actions, and tries to chalk everything up to panic. And then he starts begging. He starts begging for another chance at survival, begins to beg, and for a moment makes it seem believable, but they all have had enough of him. After all, neither of them ever felt comfortable around him. Tabitha stops his begging and tells him that he screwed up big time. He never bothered to actually check up on Justin. Otherwise, he would have known that Justin's ankle was simply sprained, something that has already fixed itself. And then Carl tells him that his plan was lousy at best and disgusting at worst. While Carl was passed out, the group of the crossed simply passed him without noticing him. If Richie actually wanted to slow them down, he should have dragged Carl out in the open. But then again, Richie wasn't exactly known for his smarts in the group. Tabitha then reveals that when the two of them failed to show up, the group decided to go back and check on them. They managed to hide and stay still while letting the group of the Crossed simply pass them, and Richie finally realizes it. His actions were useless. If he had simply stuck with the group, they all would have easily survived. There was no need to knock out Carl, because the group and Carl both were able to pass the Crossed by simply hiding. And then Carl's next words hit Richie like a high-caliber bullet in the heart. He feels his stomach sink and his heartbeat stop for a moment as Carl says, "It was all good until then, but that scream you let out a little while back, that'll bring them around now." And Richie, the super survivor, now realizes his basic and stupid mistakes. He not only doomed himself, but the entire group. And so, no wonder the group came back to confront him and ransack him. And like all his moments of hardship and pressure, Richie is now turning towards anger. Carl confesses that the moment he heard the scream, he knew it was Richie, and the only reason he came back was to shoot Richie in the head. But then he looks down at the bones sticking out of Richie's knee and laughs. He tells Richie that he has already taken care of what he wanted to do, and with these last words, the group starts to leave. They don't care about him, not one bit, but as they go, they see Richie being transformed into his true self, something he has always been, and trying to come to terms with using his memories since his story started. He is a Crossed in human form, a human so loathful and psychotic that he is no different from the infected. He begins to weep, frown, seethe with anger, all the while he screams, "Fuckers, you evil fucking lumps of shit! You think you're better than me? You're leaving me for the Crossed, just like fucking cocksuckers, fucking assholes. Who do you think you are?" And then, slowly, these words become nothing but pointless obscenities. Just like we've seen the Crossed target and abuse the people they knew before the infection in the past, Richie begins to target the members of the group one by one. He targets Tabitha first, and once he is done with his obscenities for her, he tells her that she wouldn't survive a second in this world if she never had the help of the group. Richie's words don't seem to affect her, but she does miss a step. Richie then turns his attention to Carl, and after the obligatory vicious words, he calls him out on his policy of leaving no man behind. Richie asserts that this policy is going to be the end of the entire group. It is then Luke's turn, someone that has had nothing to do with Richie all this while, but Richie sounds and acts just like one of the Crossed right, and so to him it doesn't matter. He targets Luke and says, "And fuck you, Luke, fuck your family, fuck your trauma, and fuck what happened to them. Loser, loser, you got what you deserved." And Richie's rant continues because he targets Justin next. He calls him the usual obscenities, but goes a step further by calling him slurs, because Justin is gay. He claims that Justin is simply miffed that Richie got to ditch the group before he got the chance. Joe tries to calm down Justin because it's clear that the slurs are getting to him, but that is when Richie turns his attention to Joe, and Joe stops dead in his tracks. Richie screams, "And you, Joe? How much use was your gun nut bullshit when time came, huh? You couldn't save your family." Joe is contemplating his choices, using every ounce of his will to keep himself from shooting Richie in the head. But then, when he turns his attention to Lauren and begins to objectify her, Joe loses it. He storms back towards Richie with his hand on his gun, and this is more than enough to shut Richie up. He is shaking and trembling while sitting against the jagged stone wall of the cliff, but Joe does something totally unexpected. Instead of shooting Richie in the head, he simply tosses his gun at Richie's feet. They took all his supplies and rifle, which is why Joe is leaving him his revolver, as a way of showing Richie that he isn't human, that he isn't one of them. He is doing this to snap Richie out of his rant so that he can realize that he is no different than the Crossed. Joe poses the question, "Who do you think we are, Richie?" And Richie simply stares up at him in disbelief. Tabitha joins the conversation in an attempt to stop Joe from doing anything stupid, and says that in these times it's quite hard to figure out who they are, but Joe knows who he is. He tells the entire group that they should be happy that they are not Richie and they should stick to it. And this is when realization once again hits Richie like a bullet. For a man who hasn't had a gunshot wound all his life, he sure seems to know the pain. Crossed dead or alive. Issue number 12, Reap Your Crop. A lot happened in the last comic, but now that we catch up with Richie again, a lot of time has passed since then, and Richie is back to his old ways, back to being the hero of his story, back to being selfish, and back to painting himself as the good guy. He is desperately trying to reach for the gun left by Joe while grunting, straining, and visibly hurting. However, his inner monologue is solely focused on self-preservation. He wants to live and he will do anything for it. But now that he can hear the Crossed coming, he wants to shoot himself in the head before they get to him. He finally manages to grab the revolver, and once he does, he holds it close to his chest. But that is when the memory of the plane crash begins haunting him again. Kelly's screams begin echoing in his ear. She is calling out to him for help. But for some reason, this traumatizes Richie, and Richie's darkest secret is finally revealed. We then see the moments before Richie had managed to escape the crashed plane. He is fiddling the door, trying to open it, when Kelly manages to find him and call out to him. Her arm is broken and she is bleeding from her shoulder. She wants his help and she doesn't want him to leave without her. But young Richie is hell-bent on getting the door open. As this memory haunts Richie, we see the Crossed running towards him in the present day. Back in the memory, Kelly is trying to reach out to him, begging Richie for help. But the young Richie simply tells her to get away from him. He tells her to piss off. Richie winces in the modern day as he remembers his last conversation with Kelly. She had begun to question their relationship, begun to question Richie's promises of marrying her and saving her from peril. But all Richie could say to her was, "Get off of me! For fuck's sake, I need to get the door open." The Crossed are closing in on Richie in the modern day as we finally see what is making him wince. It isn't the words he spoke or his broken leg, but it's what he did when Kelly wouldn't stop asking for his help. He elbowed her in the face and knocked her out instantly. We then see modern day Richie get up like a zombie, and instead of pointing the gun at himself, he points it at the Crossed and pulls the trigger. Click, it's empty. He then remembers Joe's gun etiquette. He always kept the first chamber empty so as not to shoot himself, and so without a moment to spare, Richie pulls the trigger again and again and again. He keeps pulling it until he has managed to shoot all of his attackers in the head, and he begins to laugh. Richie begins to once again revel in his victory. He laughs like a maniac as he says, "Ha ha ha, fuck you, you assholes. The fucking joke's on you. I'm going to live. I'm going to heal. So fuck you and fuck your compassion. Fuck your loyalty. Fuck all of your shit from beginning to end." But as we've come to know, but Richie hasn't, Richie's luck usually runs out when he begins celebrating, and that is exactly what happens the next moment. Richie turns around and watches another group of the Crossed emerge from the shadows of the woods. Richie panics, looks around frantically, and upon realizing that he has no chance of surviving, he puts the gun under his chin and with tears streaming down his face, he pulls the trigger. Click, it's empty. Richie has used all of his bullets and he will now have to suffer. Karma has finally gotten him. Richie screams out in horror as he watches the Crossed laughing and staring down at him, and then it happens. The Crossed begin having their way with him. They begin dismembering him, violating him, and in his moments of torture, Richie finally realizes it, that he likely is more related to the Crossed than humans. In his dying moments, his last words are, "Why didn't it shock me that I didn't miss Dad? Or how easy I found it to walk away? Or how simple it was to fit in the world the way it was right now? Do I like things the way they are right now? Well, you know, I guess so." And we then get a last glimpse of Kelly, bleeding from the nose, knocked out in the plane as flames surround her. The plane door is open, but Richie is gone. He could have taken her with him. He could have saved her, but he didn't. I guess she got what you get for loving a person like Richie. The end.